Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Academia Sinica Lecture. Today, our speaker, Professor Quentin Skinner, will give his second lecture, and his topic is Genealogy of Liberty. The moderator of today's lecture is the Vice President of Academia Sinica, Dr. Fan Wang. Now let's welcome VP Wang to give us a few words. Please, Dr. Wang.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor. It is a great honor for me to introduce to you Professor Quentin Skinner for the second Academia Sinica Lecture. The scheduled moderator of this lecture is Premier Yiwa Jiang, but he is not able to come due to the urgent condition for the state. Some of you know that Premier Jiang was Professor Skinner's orphan when he visited Cambridge in the year 2000. Professor Skinner is currently the Barbara Newman Professor of Humanities at Queen Mary University. He was previously the Research Professor of Modern History at the University of Cambridge. As a historian of ideas, I regularly read Professor Skinner's work and use them in the courses I teach. In fact, I find several of my former students in the audience. His tremendously powerful paper, wrote in 25, published in his 28, Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, demolished many prevalent myths about the task of intellectual history in the late 60s and successfully established the foundation of contextualism of Cambridge School that he is the most famous representative. Professor Skinner is one of the most influential historians of political thought of our time, and the historical analysis of the idea of liberty is one of the major contributions that makes the fame. Beginning from 1984, 10 lectures on the paradoxes of political liberty, which pioneered in analyzing how Machiavellian idea of political liberty constitute a negative freedom, while encouraging the virtuous citizen to civic participation to preserve their common freedom. Later on, he carried on the historical inquiry to establish a neo-Roman tradition of liberty, which constitute a third concept of liberty and used to be the predominant idea of liberty before the rise of liberalism. Professor Skinner's historical research brings forth many important insights and research agendas which have wide influences on contemporary scholarship. Today's lecture is entitled A Genealogy of Liberty, in which he will deploy the new mode of analysis into the history of the idea of liberty. I believe he will provide many novel insights and synthesis on the issues. He has been well known. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Quentin Skinner.
Good. Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much for this very warm introduction. I do want to start again by thanking you all also for letting me come here and speak English to you. It's a very great privilege, and it's an enormous privilege, of course, to be here. Well, my theme today is the idea of individual liberty, and to invoke it is obviously to speak of one of the central values in the democracies of Asia as well as in the West. So it would be good if I could manage to work towards a definition of the term expressed by the concept, a definition on which we might, in principle, all be able to agree. But as I said last time, in talking about the concept of genealogy, I'm strongly inclined to agree with the Nietzschean view that if you can show of a concept that it has a history, then you cannot show that it has a definition. Concepts with histories cannot have definitions. And freedom is unquestionably one of the concepts that has been most contested in the modern world. So we cannot hope to proceed in the traditional philosophical manner of conceptual analysis. We can't do that. So the question is, how should we proceed? And as I also said last time, it seems to me that the most revealing way in which to proceed is by the method of genealogy. That's to say, trying to show how this concept has evolved and developed in our societies, and how it has come to be contested, and how rival understandings of how to think about the concept have emerged. So that is what I'm going to attempt. But obviously that's an enormous question, and somehow I've got to bring the materials under some kind of control. And so what I've decided to do is to talk this afternoon about how the concept of freedom has been discussed in the Anglophone tradition of political philosophy. So as I said also on Monday, I come before you talking about my own tribe and what we have thought about the concept of freedom. Now, of course, that is parochial, but it so happens that the Anglophone way of thinking about freedom, partly because it was so much taken up in American political theory, has come to be of importance in the modern world. And so I hope that my reflections will not seem too parochial. If they do, then you should think of yourself as an anthropologist, just looking at this person coming from this different tribe. Now, genealogies differ from conventional narratives in not having an obvious point of beginning, and also equally obviously in not having an end. But in the case of the genealogy of liberty, there is, I think you might call it, a least arbitrary moment at which we can begin, and that is, as it happens, with by far the most famous work of political philosophy ever written in the English language, namely Thomas Hobbes's masterpiece, Leviathan, first published in 1651. And that is the earliest work in the English language of political philosophy in which there's a systematic attempt to discuss what Hobbes calls the liberty of subjects, what we would think of as civil liberty, or the liberty of individual citizens. And a further merit of beginning with Hobbes is that his understanding of civil liberty has turned out to be extraordinarily influential. So that his analysis is also a very familiar one, as you will see if we look at our first slide. Can you all see it all right? Good. I'm looking at the back. Yes? Very good. Well, I've called this, as you see, the liberal concept of individual freedom. Oh, by the way, just a purely terminological point, I see I've put freedom there and I've put liberty in the title of the lecture. Obviously they're not exact synonyms, but nothing that I say this afternoon depends on any difference that you might be able to find between the word freedom and the word liberty. I mean, the truth is the English language is partly a Germanic language, so freedom is just Freiheit, German, but it's mostly a Latin language, and so liberty is just a translation of the Latin word, libertas. And there's no difference. I mean, as perhaps you know, English has two words for everything. So here it is, freedom. And as you see, it's a very simple concept. It just has two components. And it says that for an individual to enjoy freedom as the citizen of a state, there must be power on the part of the individual to act in pursuit of a given alternative, and there must be no interference with the exercise of that power by any external agencies. So you've just got two components, power and interference. And let me just say a word about both of these in turn. First, let's look at the idea of power. Here, Hobbes is insisting on the idea, valuably, I think, that it makes no sense to talk about freedom of action except in relation to your having a power to act, an ability to act. I mean, that is worth saying because there's quite a strong tendency in current Anglophone philosophy to suppose, I quote for example Jerry Cohen in his essay Freedom and Money, 2008, that inability is a sufficient condition of unfreedom, so that freedom is the same as power. And that view is also taken up by Amartya Sen in his great book, Development as Freedom, of 1999. But I think Hobbes is useful here in suggesting that this is not the right way of thinking about freedom in relation to power. And here's the point. If you lack power to do a certain action, so for example, if you lack the power to walk on water, then Hobbes would say you're not free to walk on water, but you're also not unfree to walk on water because you're simply unable to do it. You lack the power. But if you lack power, then it makes no sense to talk about freedom. What you lack is not freedom, you just lack power. You must keep those two concepts apart, and the relationship of the concepts is that talking about freedom is always nested within talking about power. Foucault's point about power. But the reason it's Foucault's point is that he's taken it from Hobbes. As he says. So what is primary is power, and freedom is not to be confused with power. Now, lack of freedom is not the same as lack of power, and this brings out what is important about this distinction, because lack of freedom means that you have been disempowered. It's not the same as lack of power, it is being disempowered. So someone must have disempowered you. It's not just that you don't have this power, it's been taken away from you. And that is what lack of freedom is, disempowerment. Now let's turn to the second idea, the idea of interference, and what you see here is that this is really a way of Hobbes thinking about the core idea of disempowerment. You are said to be unfree because you are disempowered if some other agency has interfered with the exercise of a power. So on this analysis, freedom simply consists in no interference. What is it to be free? It is for there to be no interference. By the way, that also explains why in current political theory in the West, in Anglophone political theory, freedom is usually described as a negative concept. That's to say, the presence of freedom is always marked by the absence of something. It's a negative concept. The presence is marked by an absence. So if you ask, well, what is the absence that marks the presence of freedom? The answer is absence of interference. Well, there's the analysis, but that doesn't get us very far, because if what you want to say is freedom is simply absence of interference, it turns out that what you need to understand then is the concept of interference. What does that mean? What is to count as interference? So to understand freedom on the liberal analysis, what you have to understand is what counts as interference. Now again, the Hobbesian analysis is a very simple one, and here it is. An external agency is said to interfere when it acts upon the body of an individual agent in such a way that an action counterfactually within the power of that agent is either prevented or compelled due to the application of physical force by the external agent in such a way that the pursuit of any alternative is rendered impossible. So there is the Hobbesian analysis of interference. What is interference? There is the account. So for Hobbes, and I quote the Leviathan, chapter 21, freedom is absence of external impediment to motion. So there's the Hobbesian account. Let's just look at it for a moment, and I would like to make 3 points about it. First, you see at the top of the slide, I've said agencies. not just agents, an external agency. And the reason I want to say agency is to keep the predication wide. That's to say, on Hobbes's account, the agency that could take away your power to act might be an individual human agency, it might be a corporate human agency, but it also might be a natural agency. I mean, if my coming here this afternoon had been stopped by the rain, then for Hobbes there's nothing peculiar about saying that what took away my freedom was the rain. It's the agent, it's a natural agency which took away my power to act. So agency, not just an agent. Secondly, notice at the middle of the slide that you can always be disempowered. This is obviously right. You can always be disempowered in one of two ways. This external agency can maybe prevent you from exercising a power, but it may also, by the exercise of power, cause you to act in a certain way. That's to say, to force you. So prevention or physical compulsion are always going to be two different possibilities about how you lose a power to act that you counterfactually have, and thus lose freedom. Now, my third point, which is also there at the middle of the slide, is a very I think to us, a very counterintuitive thing that Hobbes wants to say about freedom. This is more surprising, which is that it is only bodily interference that takes away freedom. It's only interference with your physical body. And the massively important implication of that is that if it is only your will that is coerced, not your body, as for example, suppose you obey the law, but you only obey the law because of a fear of the consequences of disobeying. So your will, we would be inclined to say, your will is forced. I mean, the knowledge that there is a penalty stops you from acting in a certain way. Hobbes says, well, of course it doesn't stop you from acting. So he wants to say that coercion of the will does not take away freedom. Very important claim for him. Coercing your will doesn't take away your freedom to act. Only coercing your body takes away freedom to act. As Hobbes summarizes, this is again chapter 21 of the Leviathan, fear and liberty are consistent. Now Hobbes really means that, and he illustrates the doctrine with an example which is actually very common in early modern philosophy, which is the example of the highwayman, or we might say the mugger. This is the person who stops you in the street and points a gun at you and says your money or your life. That's what they would say. Locke also quotes this, your money or your life. Now Hobbes says you're being given a choice. Don't forget that. Your money or your life. So when you hand over your money, that was a completely free action, because you were also completely free to refuse to hand it over, in which case you've handed over your life. He says, so, you've chosen to do one thing and not the other. But if you've chosen, then you're free. And Hobbes summarizes in a rather nasty joke when he says, when you hand over your money, you not only do it willingly, you do it very willingly. So don't say you weren't free. So he really wants this point, that it's only bodily coercion that takes away freedom. Now, that is the Hobbesian analysis, and before I leave it, what I want to note is that this way of thinking about freedom is still quite widely accepted in Anglophone political philosophy. For example, if you look at two of the most ambitious recent treatises on the theory of freedom, it is exactly this picture that they want you to accept. I'm thinking, for example, of Ian Carter's book, The Measure of Freedom, 1999, or Matthew Kramer's book, The Quality of Freedom, 2003. So what I'm saying is that this part of the genealogy comes right down into the 21st century. Matthew Kramer's remarkable book, The Quality of Freedom, published by Oxford University Press, 2003. It's a major treatise, 400 pages, very good book, except that it criticizes me. But although it's 400 pages, I do not see that it says anything except this. So I've saved you a lot of trouble. You don't need to read it. Now, looking at this analysis, you might think there's something obviously wrong with this. And what looks obviously wrong, I think, to many people is this insistence that coercion of the will does not take away freedom. Whether or not you think that, and of course Matthew Kramer and others do not think that, but whether or not you think that, if we're doing genealogy, the next thing I need to note is that in the generation following Thomas Hobbes in Anglophone political philosophy, this is one of the points that's recurrently picked up in opposition to Hobbes. And the most celebrated political philosopher of the generation immediately after Hobbes is John Locke, the author of the two treatises of government, first published in 1690, probably the most celebrated text of liberal political theory in the Anglophone tradition. So, pursuing my genealogy, I now want to turn from Hobbes to Locke, to the next generation. Now, you could summarize what Locke wants to say about civil liberty by saying that, of course, he agrees with this. He doesn't disagree that if you have a power which is physically taken away from you, then you're unfree to exercise it. I mean, nobody doubts that. But what he wants to insist is that you will also have your freedom taken from you if your will has been coerced. And he makes this point in paragraph 176 of the second treatise, I quote, "Should a robber break into my house and with a dagger at my throat make me seal documents to convey my estate to him, would that give him a title?" And the question is purely rhetorical, because what Locke wants you to see is that I have no real alternative. The dagger is at my throat. I'm going to die. And he's saying, sign the document. I'm going to do that. And so what you have to say may not be completely clear, but what you have to say is, well, I'm not really acting fully freely. This isn't complete freedom. I'm being coerced. I don't really want to do this. I'm doing it, but it's contrary to my will. Now, of course, it's not that the action is now impossible for me to perform. It's just that you're not freely choosing to perform it. It's not a wholly free action. So if we add that thought of Locke's to the genealogy, this is how it looks. Now we have Hobbes's account over on the left wing. Of course, Hobbes doesn't want to be on the left wing, but that's where I've put him. So Hobbes's account is over there on the left, but the Lockean addition is now what most people would want to add, that the action can be prevented or compelled either by bodily action or what Locke calls bending the will. And the standard way to bend the will is by coercion. Locke's phrase, bending your will to their designs. But now notice that, and this is what keeps happening if you think of freedom as a negative concept, is that it turns out that we have a new concept now that we're facing, which Hobbes does not have to face, and that is the concept of coercion. Hobbes is not interested in coercion because he thinks that has nothing to do with freedom. But once you think in these terms, we now are left saying, well, what is coercion? I mean, what do you mean by that? There's another concept that we've introduced, which will need an account given of it. Now, that being so, it's quite surprising, I think, that Locke in the second treatise never attempts a definition of coercion. All he does is to offer some examples of what he calls bending someone's will to their designs. And that is in paragraph 222 of the second treatise. And the examples he gives are threats, promises, offers, bribes. These are 4 ways in which I can bend you to my will. But if you think about those 4 examples, surely what they suggest is actually we need an analysis here, because take the case of a bribe. is it really true that if I offer you a bribe, I thereby coerce you to act in a certain way, such that you're able to say, I mean, suppose you're a politician and you accept a bribe, and now you're in a court of law, and your defense is, well, this bribe, it was so enormous, I had no alternative, but my will was totally bent by this. So that is not going to impress the judge. That's not an example of coercion, he'll say. You're completely responsible for having taken the bribe. So when Locke includes bribes, that seems a mistake. But in that case, what we want is an account of what is coercion. Locke doesn't provide an account, and as far as I can see, the earliest Anglophone legal and political philosopher who sees that you've got to give an analysis of this concept is Jeremy Bentham, great English legal reformer of the 18th century, who writes a major treatise, although he doesn't publish it, in 1806 called Of Laws in General. And in that, he offers us an analysis of the concept of coercion. So I want to look at that for a moment, and so my genealogy here is passing from the late 17th to the late 18th century. Now, Bentham's proposal is that we can distinguish two categorically different ways in which someone can bend my will. One is to promise you a reward if you comply with my will. So I say, if you do what I ask, I'll give you $1 million. The other way is to threaten you with penalties if you do not comply with my will. So I say, if you don't do what I ask, I'll kill you, or something like that. So there's promising rewards for compliance, or there's threatening penalties for non-compliance. And either of those will cause you to act. Now, Bentham's proposal is that we can properly speak of coercion only in the second case. But in the second case, we can always speak of coercion. So that's what coercion is. It is causing compliance with my will by successfully threatening penalties. Now, that's not enough for coercion, because there must be something which is also true about the threat itself. I mean, I must think, when you say to me, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you, I must think that that's credible. I must also think that the threat is serious, and I mean, clearly that is a serious threat. But the third point that Bentham makes is that I must believe this threat to be immediate. That's to say, there's nothing I can do about this. I'm in this position. This threat is credible, serious, and immediate. In that case, your will is bent. So let's incorporate Bentham's refinement, and there it is. Coercion is when an alternative, this is a good word of Bentham's, is rendered ineligible. That's to say you wouldn't vote for it. You would never vote for this to happen. By means of a threat which has these particular qualities. It's credible, immediate, and serious. Now, is this the account of freedom that you want? I mean, if it is, this is a very short lecture. Well, it's important that in the Anglophone tradition, a lot of philosophers have wanted to say, yes, that's it. There it is. You wanted to know about civil liberty? Now you know. And the most famous work in which that is the preferred analysis is the most influential work of the last generation on the theory of civil liberty, Isaiah Berlin's essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. His preferred concept is that one. You're looking at it. So notice that just as the Hobbesian strand of the genealogy has come down to our time, so you could write Matthew Kramer right over there, so has the Lockean one, and you could write Isaiah Berlin over here. However, within the liberal tradition, notice we're now in the early 19th century, there arises a further complicating moment in the analysis of freedom only a generation after Bentham, in another of the most famous essays of the Anglophone tradition on the theory of freedom, John Stuart Mill's essay called On Liberty, 1859. One of the moves that Mill makes, and I now want to say a word about John Stuart Mill, is to point out that the liberal tradition so far has endorsed one claim. All of these writers have endorsed one claim which he thinks is questionable. And here it is at the very middle of the top. That the interference must be by external agencies. Notice nobody has doubted that. Another person, another agency, a human agency, a natural agency, a corporate agency, but always an external agency. But what Mill asks in chapter 3 of the Essay on Liberty is it true that liberty is always interpersonal in that way? This all presupposes that freedom is an interpersonal concept. Mill asks, is that true? Or, here's the alternative, could you make sense of the suggestion that the agent who takes away your freedom could be yourself? It's you who do it. Not an external agency, but you. Can we make sense of that? Well, as soon as you introduce that thought, the story begins to get more complicated. We now have this suggested genealogy, where it's either external agencies or the self that can prevent or compel actions due to the operation of, well, what? I mean, now that's the question. I mean, how can we make sense of this idea? How could the self take away the freedom of the self? Now, these are deep philosophical waters about the notion of selfhood, but I think without undue simplification, we would be right to say that within the Anglophone tradition, there have been three main answers given to this question. And I'd now like to say a word about each of them. There's one possibility. Now, that thought that you can be a slave to passion, that your passions can take away your freedom, is present in Mill, but this is actually an ancient thought. This is as old as Western philosophy. This is a thought of Plato's, one of his central thoughts in the Timaeus, his analysis of the human soul. And in Anglophone philosophy, this thought is as old as Erasmus's translation of Plato's Timaeus into English in the early 16th century. So the key suggestion here that your passions can undermine your freedom is Plato's picture of the human soul, in which the mind is held to be capable of reasoning, and that it consists of the will, and that the will can ally itself either with reason or with passion. So the picture of the mind is there's a will, and you can will as a result of passion, or you can will as a result of reason. And the claim is, if you will as a result of passion, that is not freedom. That is what they like to call license instead of liberty. That's licentious action, not free action, not freedom but license. Only if you ally the will with reason are your actions truly free. So notice the very strong connection here proposed between freedom and reason. Only actions undertaken out of reason are thought to be free. I mean, in modern philosophy, that doctrine is usually associated with Kant. But as I've said, it's a classical view, and you also find it in 17th century philosophy. For example, it's a key doctrine of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, in which this distinction between liberty and license is absolutely central to the argument. Notice, by the way, that Hobbes has no distinction between liberty and license, because for Hobbes, all action comes from passion. Reason is inert. But on this tradition, there is one answer to the way that the self can undermine the freedom of the self. Now, as I say, that thought is present in Mill, but that's not his central thought. His central thought is that, as he says in chapter 3, in our time, meaning in the 19th century, the yoke of law, which has not been so heavy, what has been heavy is the yoke of opinion. And it's certainly true that the earlier discussions I've talked of mainly think of the citizen confronting the state. So the idea is the freedom of the individual versus the law of the state, and the question is how you negotiate that freedom. Mill is saying that is incomplete. Besides the individual and the state, there is the individual and society. And society is an embodiment of conventions, of norms about how one ought to behave. And if those norms are very strong, as Mill thought they were in 19th century England, then you may be so affected by those norms and what they demand of you. They're not laws, but they make demands upon you, and those might be so strong that you are led inauthentically to internalize the norm, such that you don't see that your freedom has been affected. So the norm becomes your desire. So there is the second possibility. You become an inauthentic person. And Mill expresses that thought in chapter 3 of the essay on liberty, speaking of the people of England, where he says the people of England think they are free because, but they choose what, they think they're free, but they're not, because they choose what is customary in preference to their inclinations, to the point where it does not occur to them to have inclinations except for what is customary. And then Mill says, at that point, the mind is bound to the yoke. Notice the image of slavery there, that you can become so inauthentic that you don't see that custom, which is second nature, has become nature. Now, I've said that is Mill's view, and it's central to his philosophy, but it is also a very influential view, and of course the most influential tradition that took it up in the 20th century was in existentialist philosophy, this insistence that the will has to be an authentic will, so that you have to will what you will. As Sartre always said, you're not free unless you have chosen to will what you choose to will. So there's a second possibility. Now let me round off by mentioning a third possibility, which is this. Now this is an extraordinarily strong concept which enters into 19th century social philosophy. You can see something very like it in Mill, who talks about permanent interests of man as a progressive being, as he says. So the notion that your consciousness embodies certain true interests, which you might be false to. It's very close to the idea of inauthenticity. But the idea that your consciousness might be false to your interests is the view that we associate most commonly with Marxist philosophy, and certainly that is one of Marx's views. And from Marx's texts, that also comes to be extremely influential in 20th century social philosophy. The social philosopher of our own day who has adapted Marx's view of false consciousness and made it central to his philosophy for a time in his early social philosophy was Jürgen Habermas, especially in his works of the 1960s, where he imagines the Marxist thought that social being is determining your consciousness. So your consciousness is determined by social circumpressures, and the social being that you have is the product of a consumerist, a capitalist and consumerist society, such that your aspirations themselves become consumerist. They become capitalist aspirations. But those aspirations, Habermas would agree with Marx, are contrary to your real interests. So they embody a false account of what is in your interests, even though it may be the account that you would give. So here is a social philosophy which strongly opposes phenomenal desire, that's to say, what if you were asked you would be inclined to say you want, with what are really in your interests, which may be masked from you by the operations of your society. So there's the great ideology critique that stems from Marxism. So there is how we can make sense, I think, in at least three ways of the idea that the self could be the agent that takes away the freedom of the self. And just to show you that I'm a proper Foucauldian, I add that. I'm not claiming that it's exhaustive, and indeed there might be something incoherent about the idea of an exhaustive classification, so we want to say other possibilities. And if in discussion you can tell me about some other possibilities, then that would be particularly welcome. Well, now we have an array of different conceptions of freedom, and definitely a genealogy rather than a narrative, because we've got three lines of descent here, which are potentially separate from each other. But notice that there's still something that everybody agrees about. Every philosopher I've mentioned so far agrees, and it's at the top there, that freedom is in some sense absence of interference. Notice everything stems from that. It might be absence of interference by the self, and that complicates things hugely, but it's still the fundamental notion is interference. And so you could say, all I've done so far is to analyze this concept of interference, and that's true, that's all I've done. But now I want to notice that towards the end of the 19th century, notice that's where the genealogy has now reached, post-Marxist social philosophy, a number of Anglophone philosophers begin to argue that what we're looking at is radically incomplete, and indeed may be completely wrong as an account of how to think about freedom. Now, these are the Anglophone writers who, in a very important moment in the history of Anglophone political philosophy, begin to draw their inspiration above all from Hegel, from Kant, from Hegel, and from the German tradition of phenomenology. And what these writers want to say in typical Hegelian terms is that what you're looking at is an analysis only of the negative moment in a dialectic of liberty. Liberty is a dialectical notion, and here you're looking at the negative moment of the dialectic. Absence of impediment, of course. If you're to be free, there must be an absence of impediment, but the positive moment of the dialectic asks you, well, what is this freedom for? Why do you want absence of interference? What is freedom for? To understand freedom, you have to understand the answer to that question. And that question is nowhere here. It just isn't there. Except, you might say, this is what a liberal theorist will say, no, it is there, because you already find it at the top of the chart. It must be no interference from whatever you want to do, obviously. There's no interference with your desires. Whatever option you may want to entertain, whatever power you may want to exercise. So it is there. So in that way you could say there's a positive element in any theory of freedom. You can always ask, why do you want this non-interference? What do you want this freedom for? And you might think it's a great strength of the liberal analysis that the answer is, well, anything you want. You can't fill out that answer. But that is what gets doubted in the Hegelian tradition, that you can't fill it out. They want to say, according to this view of things, you can fill it out. In order to count as free, you must not merely act at will. You must act, and here's the crucial claim, in such a way as to realize the essence of yourself. That is freedom. Not acting in any way, but acting in such a way as realizes to yourself who you really are. Now, a late 19th century exponent of this view, T.H. Green, I quote, puts it in this form: to be free is to have realized that which we have it in ourselves to become. So the free person is the person in whom being and becoming have come together. This person has become that which they can be. So notice that what this wants to say about what we're looking at is that all of this is wrong because to be free is not to have the possibility of acting in a certain way, possibility of exercising your powers. To be free is to have exercised your powers in a certain way. That's to say, the way that will most fully realize who you are. Well, there we stare into a very large conceptual gulf, separating this view of freedom from all of the ones I've talked about, because these are all theories of negative freedom. They differ from each other, but they all agree that in some sense it's no interference. But what the writers I'm now wanting to talk about want to say is very well summarized in someone who agrees with their view, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, in his classic essay, What's Wrong with Negative Liberty? Notice there should be no question mark there. And also in his great treatise, Sources of the Self. What Taylor says, and this puts it very well, I think, is that it's a mistake to think of freedom as what he calls an opportunity concept. That's to say, being free is being able to do something. He wants to say that freedom must be understood as what he calls an exercise concept. You're not free unless you have exercised your powers in a certain way. So here is the idea. Now the genealogy is suddenly much more complicated, because right at the top we have a challenge which says that freedom is not non-interference. It has nothing to do with non-interference. It is to do with self-realization, to realizing the essence of your nature. Now, here's a big question for us all. Do you think it makes sense to speak of some activities as being fully human and other activities as not being fully human? Would you ever find yourself saying of an action that was inhuman? I mean, in the English language, that's a perfectly standard thing to say. I thought that was inhuman. If you find yourself thinking like that, you're thinking that there's something to be, that here's what you're thinking. You're thinking that human nature is normative. You're thinking that there's something that is specifically human and there are other things which are not, and that we can say what they are. Now, I said we can say what they are, but what are they? I mean, what would be candidates for thinking like this? Now, here I'm talking about the Western tradition all along this afternoon, but within the Western tradition, there have really only been two major answers that have been given to that question. And the rivalry between those two answers is the subject of one of the great works of Western philosophy, Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, in which he sets these two answers against each other. And one answer was given in classical philosophy in the West, in Greek philosophy, and one answer was given in response to classical philosophy by Christianity. The great enemy of classicism is Christianity. And here is the classical answer. Here is Aristotle's thought that man is, as he says, zoon politikon, man is the political animal. That's to say, to realize the essence of your nature most fully, to be most fully human, is to exercise your powers in the public realm, to place your talents at the public good, to take part in the ruling of your own community, to serve in the public sphere. That's the most fully and truly human enterprise. Now that's what Christianity, early Christianity, disputes, and here's the Christian attack on it. This is what Nietzsche is dramatizing, the morality of the slaves, the Christians, as Nietzsche says, triumphs over classical morality by saying that what the service that makes you most truly free and makes you most truly yourself is not service to the public and the common good, it is service to God. And service to God takes you away from thinking about the public and the common good in the name of a higher good. And the serving of that higher good is true freedom. So an incredible, really complex claim of Christianity, that serving God is your highest duty, not serving the common good, but serving another world, not this world, as a result of which, as Machiavelli says, Nietzsche, of course, picking up from Machiavelli, that leaves the world to the wicked. If you take the good out of the world, because they're thinking about the next world. But the reason they're thinking about the next world is they wish to be free, and what freedom is serving God. So there's the huge paradox. Freedom is service, and the question is service to whom? And the first answer says, to your fellow mankind. And the second answer says, service to God. Now, obviously, the second answer is not a political answer at all. It is this wholesale rejection of politics that you get in the Christian tradition, thinking about another world instead of this world. But the first answer is the most political answer you could possibly give. And I've moved away from the Anglophone tradition in order to talk about the source of this story, but within Anglophone philosophy, right down to our own time, you find real Aristotelians and Hegelians. And in our own time, the most famous philosopher who has taken this view has been Hannah Arendt, especially in her book Between Past and Present. I quote Arendt, "Freedom consists in politics." Notice that. Politics is freedom. Freedom is politics. And the reason that she wants that equation is what she wants you to understand is that the activity of self-government and the social virtues that are required for putting yourself successfully at the service of your community are the activities in which you most fully realize and recognize in yourself what you have it in yourself to become. So there's true self-realization. I quote Charles Taylor, who completely agrees, "Freedom resides, at least in part, in the collective control of our common life." So there is what gets called positive liberty, and there it is coming down to our own time, this strand of the genealogy as well. And of course, I again want to say this, because I'm not saying that those are all exhaustive. If anyone has another view about a genealogy for self-realization, I would be really fascinated to hear about it. Now I really do need to pause, because I think that within contemporary Anglophone political philosophy, it would now be agreed that what you are looking at is something here is the way to think about freedom. Obviously there are different traditions, but I've now laid the whole story out for you. What I want to say this afternoon, and this is the most important thing I want to say this afternoon, is that I don't agree with any of this. I don't think we've started. That's what I want to say. There's something missing here which is absolutely crucial, and we need to add it back. It used to be in our tradition, but it's not now. And I think if we go right back to Hobbes, who is the demon of modernity, rarely do I agree with Leo Strauss, but I think Leo Strauss's view of Hobbes as the demon of modernity is right here. This is all Hobbes's fault. That the idea that freedom is just non-interference masks something which we need to notice, which is that when Hobbes says that, and that becomes so influential, there was something that he was attacking. There was a view that he was trying to discredit and set aside, and he really succeeded. There's another view of negative liberty flourishing before the 17th century that Hobbes succeeds in discrediting. And I want to try to end this afternoon by resurrecting this way of thinking about freedom. So what is it that Hobbes really hated in discussions about freedom, wanted to discredit, and used his theory to set aside? The answer is that it is a view of freedom which takes us right back to antiquity again, and which is most clearly formulated in what is, along with the Christian Bible, the other most influential text in Western thinking about these matters, and that is the Codex of Roman Law. The Codex of Roman Law, as codified at the end of the Roman Empire in Justinian's legal code, begins, this is how the law code begins, it begins by distinguishing two types of person. Law is about persons, and also of course about property, but insofar as it's about persons, you need to distinguish two types. And one is the free man or woman, the liber homo in Latin, and the other is the slave, the servus. Now you need that distinction because slaves are not subject to law. So if you ask, who is subject to law, which is what you must start by asking, the answer is the liber homo, the free, homo means man or woman. We don't have that word in English, unless person is the nearest we get, but Latin has the word man or woman, and that's the word homo. The liber homo is the subject of law. Now, the person subject to law is ex hypothesi free. A liber homo is a free man or woman. So the question in the Roman law is, well, what makes you free? What makes you free? Now, the suggested answer is, if you want to know what makes you free, you've got to understand what it is to be a slave. Slaves are not free. I mean, if you think there's such a thing as a free slave, that's a contradiction. So, if you understand what it is to be a slave, you will understand what it is to be free. Now, what's crucial is that what makes a slave unfree is nothing to do with whether his or her actions are interfered with. A slave who only ever does his or her master's bidding may never suffer any coercion of the will at all. Never experience it. I mean, there's nothing that this person wants to do which is contrary to the master's will. So there'll be no coercion. So what makes that person, why is that person not free? What makes you say that person is a slave if there's no interference? The answer given in the Roman law is, what makes this person unfree is they have a master. That's enough. That's what makes you unfree. Having a master makes you unfree. The mere fact of being dependent upon the arbitrary will of someone else is unfreedom. There's the Roman law. And the Roman law expresses this by saying that the distinction is between the liber homo and someone who lives in potestate, meaning we would still say in English, in the power of. You're in someone else's power. You're at their mercy. If you're living at someone else's mercy, you are a slave. If you're a slave, you're unfree. There is the analysis. So here is what is missing. And the story is much more complicated than we've been led to suppose. You will not be a liber homo. You will be a slave. If there could be interference contrary to your interests due to your being dependent on the arbitrary will of others. Obviously, if you are dependent on their will, there could be interference, because they can do what they like. But that's not what makes you unfree. It's the fact of your being dependent that makes you unfree. So you could express it differently, as some philosophers have done, by saying, Philip Pettit, the great exponent of this view in the 21st century, wants to say, speak of who has control. If there's someone else who has control of you, they may not choose to control you, but they have control, then you're a slave. Now, let me talk about this view to end. Can I begin by underlying the continuity as well as the contrast between this view, which I shall call neo-Roman for obvious reasons. It's a Roman law view of freedom. So I'm going to call it neo-Roman. Some people call it Republican, but they shouldn't. It's a neo-Roman view of freedom. The main continuity is, notice, it's a theory of negative liberty. It also says there must be something which is absent in order for you to be free. But it's not absence of interference, it's absence of dependence. So you've got three possibilities there. No dependence, no interference, self-realization. Three completely separate ways of thinking. So there's what's similar. But of course what's different is, and this is the crucial point, you could be unfree even where there is no interference. Okay? I mean, that's the condition of the contented slave. The contented slave is the slave who is never interfered with. But this person is nevertheless still a slave, and therefore unfree on this analysis, although not, of course, on the liberal analysis, because this slave has a master. Now, this claim has seemed absurd to liberal theorists of freedom. That's why Matthew Kramer's book largely takes the form of a long attack on me, which is why you mustn't read it. He wants to say, well, I mean, how could there be unfreedom if there's no interference? I mean, how could that be? Well, of course, the answer is the one that I've given. It is the mere fact of having a master that makes you unfree. But there's a second point to make, which is, if you have, of course, you may have a master without knowing it. In a slave society, you might be born a slave, in which case you are a slave, but you don't yet know it. But you cannot be a slave for long without coming to know it. But as soon as you know that you are living at someone else's mercy, then very extensive forms of self-censorship are going to take over. You're going to undermine your own freedom of action. You're going to limit it in various ways because it's now going to be of paramount importance to you to make sure that you do not act in any way that might trigger the interference which could always be there, because this person has total power over you. You're going to try to stop them exercising that power. So you're going to have to ingratiate yourself with them. You're going to have to censor yourself. You see, here's how it happens, and this is the horror of slavery. The horror of slavery is the slave is not the person who knows that something terrible is going to happen to him or her. The slave is the person who doesn't know what might happen. Anything might happen. You just don't know. Anything might happen to you, and that's going to be perfectly all right because you're a slave. Perhaps nothing bad will happen, but you don't know. And because you don't know, you're going to act in such a way as to hope to prevent anything bad happening. Now, in classical antiquity, the moralists like to put it in the form of saying, if you are a slave, you cannot fail to be slavish. If you live in servitude, you cannot fail to be servile. So, etymologically, slave and slavish come very close together. How could you fail to be slavish if you're a slave? Now, as I've said, with the emergence of liberal political philosophy in 17th century Anglophone tradition, this whole way of thinking got discredited. But it never got completely silenced. And there's a history to be written of a minority voice that keeps recurring in Anglophone political philosophy as people try to put this point in various ways. And the question that's being raised is this. Who live as slaves? Can we, in the modern world, give an answer to that? Now, there are several answers that have been given to that in modern political philosophy, and I want to end by looking at them. And the first is the one that you find in the greatest of the English neo-Roman writers, the greatest English Republican theorist of the 17th century, James Harrington, in his book Oceana, published in 1656, which, amongst other things, is an attempt to demolish Hobbes's political philosophy. It's a vehement attack on Hobbes's political philosophy from the point of view of the Republican or neo-Roman. And here is Harrington's answer. Anyone who lives as the subject of a monarch lives as a slave. Subjects of monarchs, if you think about it, they're slaves. How is that? Well, all monarchs in early modern Europe had discretionary powers, especially in the form of prerogative powers which stood outside the law. But a power outside the law is an arbitrary power. But if you are subject to arbitrary power, you're a slave. So all subjects of monarchs live as slaves. There's a crucial implication of that, which is brought out not just by Harrington, but by the most famous of the English Republicans, John Milton, the poet John Milton, in his book, The Ready and Easy Way to Establish a Free Commonwealth, which is, what that means is that if you wish to live as a free citizen, you must live in a self-governing republic. You can only be free in a democracy. That's the claim. That's the positive claim. Freedom is only possible in democracies because it's only in a democracy that you rule yourself. But if you don't rule yourself, then somebody else must be ruling you. But if somebody else is ruling you, arbitrary will, then you're a slave. And that is why in the 17th century, republics are called free states, because the ideological claim in Machiavelli, of course, which is where this is largely coming from in these writers, it's only in a republic that you can be free, because it's only in a republic that you govern yourself. So republics get called free states to distinguish them from monarchies. A monarchy is not a free state. If you wish to live in a free state, you must live in a republic. Here is a second answer. This becomes very important with the rise of the imperial powers in 18th century Europe. If you live in a colony under an imperial power, you live as a slave. Now that is the claim that was levelled against the British government by the American colonists in the 18th century. And it's also the attack that was levelled on the British government by such supporters of the American colonists as Joseph Priestley and Richard Price, and most famously, Tom Paine. The common core of the American attack on Great Britain in 1776 was that if you are governed, and especially if you are taxed by a colonial power, and have no representation in the legislative which is imposing those taxes, then that is to say that you are wholly dependent upon the mere goodwill, the arbitrary will, of that executive for the level of taxation that is imposed. But that takes away your freedom, and that's what the Declaration of Independence of the American people against the British said in 1776, because that's to say that you are at the mercy of the imperial power. The British answered, look, you can trust us. We shan't raise the level of taxation. I mean, trust us. And the American answer was, why should we trust you? I mean, there is no reason to trust where there is arbitrary power. And that is why the Declaration of 1776, which founds the American state, is called the Declaration of Independence. Independence from what? Well, from dependence, of course, from the arbitrary power of the British Crown that kept the American colonists independent, in a state of dependence. So the huge irony, here's the enormous irony of the American Revolution. The people who successfully overthrew British rule in America owned slaves. They were slave owners. They owned slaves. It was a slave society. But what they themselves, Thomas Jefferson, wanted to say to the British was that he was a slave. He knew about slavery. He owned slaves. So he really knew about slavery, and he wanted to say, I am a slave because I am subject to an arbitrary power. And that is intolerable. Why they didn't think it was intolerable for their own slaves is a very deep question. Here's a further answer. This comes to the fore in the great radical decades after the French Revolution in the 1790s, where the contention is that all women who lack independent economic means live as slaves. And that's the fundamental contention in one of the most famous of the earliest feminist treatises, Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women of 1792, where the whole argument is that women who are economically dependent upon men have to know how to commend themselves to men, so they have to take on a particular kind of personality which is inauthentic because of their dependence. But that means that they're acting slavishly, they're not acting freely, they are living as slaves. Now, John Stuart Mill adds to this, fascinatingly, in his final work of political philosophy, the essay called The Subjection of Women, which he published in 1869, 10 years after the essay on liberty, makes the point at the opening that the fact that women's property, which was still true in English law at the time, it became untrue almost immediately because of Mill, the fact that in the English law of property, women, upon marriage, had to give their property to their husbands, it became their husband's property, meant that the marriage of a woman enslaved her to the husband. And as he says in chapter 1, I see no difference between the position of such a woman and a bond slave. Incredibly strong claim. So notice, although this never is noticed, that John Stuart Mill, who is the great instance of this image of the self that we see coming through here, classical way of liberal way of thinking about freedom, converts to republicanism at the end of his life. Nor do I want to say that even contemporary democratic societies are without these elements of dependence on arbitrary power. Consider the following. What about the discretionary power of bosses in completely non-unionized labor forces, or in industries which employ illegal immigrants, which happens all over the Western world? These are workforces which are in a condition of such dependence upon their bosses that the notion of protest against unfair working conditions is out of the question. So these people live as slaves. What about the state in relation to us? Faced with threats of, or alleged threats of terrorism, the Western democratic states have been legislating furiously in the last 10 years to introduce arbitrary executive powers which bypass all legislatives and thus bypass the will of the people, in the name, of course, paradoxically, of upholding the freedom of the people, but actually increasingly turning those people into unfree citizens. Well, what about this? International corporations can coerce states, but they usually don't have to coerce states, because if an international corporation makes it clear that if a given state insists on certain labor laws or insists on certain environmental laws, then they simply will not invest. If that becomes clear, then they place that state in such a condition of dependence upon them that they are very likely, we see this all through Africa at the moment, to get their way, because the relationship is one of domination and dependence. Or, if you think of our democratic rulers, certainly in the European democracies at the moment, yet more humiliatingly for them, is the extent of their dependence upon the power of the media barons and the people who own the presses and own television companies. I mean, you can bypass this in the way that happens in Italy, because there the Prime Minister owns all the television companies. So that's all right. They don't say anything against him. But the fear that they might has, as we know now in the case of the Murdoch press in my own country, made them dependent in such a way that they can't really say what they feel, because not they know what's going to happen, but they just don't want to take any risks. So these forms of domination and dependence are around us, and I want to add that you may well be able to think, in this case, of other possibilities. Now here I am finishing. Here I draw to a close. So what I do finally is to take away all the bold type with which I've introduced the new bits and leave us with what I now think is the whole story. I end there, but I want this story to have a moral, and in fact this story has two morals, so let me take one more moment to say what they are. Genealogy is always critique. And the way it works in this case is that, at least in Anglophone moral and political philosophy at this present time, we are told that the only coherent way of thinking about freedom is this one that's running down the middle here. To take only the most distinguished example, that is the view of freedom that you find underpinning the theory of justice in John Rawls's celebrated masterpiece, A Theory of Justice. His theory of justice is a theory of equal freedom. His theory of freedom is the one in the middle. That has to be how you think about freedom. But I've spoken of people who don't think that freedom is anything to do with negativity. Look at them over here. I've now spoken of other people who think that it is to do with negativity, but nothing to do with interference. Moreover, I've tried to show everything that you're seeing in front of you here is coherent in its own terms. But that brings me to my second and final point, and here I really do end. You cannot have everything that I've got in front of you. You have to choose. Thinking about freedom, there are various possibilities here. They cannot be made into one theory. That's the great mistake to think that. There are different views here. Now, if I'm an historian, by the way. If I were a philosopher, I would now end by telling you which one you should believe. But it's not my view that teachers should come to major universities, as I have come to Taiwan, in order to tell you what to think. My view of the role of the teacher is that you should provide what the very great philosopher Wittgenstein called reminders. I think you probably knew most of what is here. I've reminded you of it. My hope is that now that you've been reminded, it will help you to think, well, what do I really feel about this? But what you really feel, I really want to say this because I've talked about freedom, is for you. Thank you very much.
Any question? Kevin first, and you.
Thank you for the... Good. Good. Thank you for the very clear, organized, and powerful talk. And I think you have just presented us a great irony. That is that a great talk on liberty and freedom make us realize that nobody is free. Because we are all interdependent by nature. And so children are dominated by parents, and students are dominated by big professors like Quentin Skinner. So nobody is free. And so this, we may take this as a joke, but I want to know, first of all, what motivated Hobbes to discredit the neo-Roman view of freedom? You said Harrington attacked Hobbes, but we don't know why Hobbes bothered to discredit the long tradition before him. That's the first question. And the second question is a little bit more technical. When you said that for John Stuart Mill, and customs and opinions are the cases in which the self takes power of the self. But aren't opinion and customs exterior instead of interior? They come from outside. They don't actually come from the self. And so I think this a little bit odd to your otherwise excellent analysis of the genealogy of liberty.
Well, thank you. These are three very important points. Let me just take them in turn. It is certainly part of my project to persuade us that we are less free than we think, yes. But it is no part of my project to tell you that in all domains of your life you are a slave. You must think of your life as having a very large number of different domains. And I want to say that it might be true even of the economically dependent woman who lives with a violent partner. I mean, that's another horror which I didn't mention about freedom in our own societies, as turns out, is wholly enslaved to this person. We would want to say that, and we would be right to say that, but there would be domains of freedom there. Even in that case, there would be domains of freedom. So I'm not here to say that in all domains of our life everyone is a slave. I am here to say that we are less free than the liberal story wants us to think. Now, I would add to that that I'm also not here to say that freedom is the only value for us. It is one very important value, but there are other values as well in our lives which we might value more than freedom. And in family life, you might value solidarity or love or other rival notions more than freedom. And it's very important to remember that it's a great mistake to suppose that all of our values can, in the way that Ronald Dworkin thinks that, love is solidarity and solidarity is freedom and everything is the same. That is really, that kind of holism, which has become very fashionable, is, I think, a very seriously mistaken way of trying to think about moral philosophy. Values collide with each other, and you have to make choices about those values. And I'm not telling you to choose freedom. I'm telling you this is what freedom is. A final thought on your first point is about interdependence. I am not here to deny that we are all interdependent. I want the interdependence not to involve dependence. There can be interdependence without dependence. So, for example, this is central to Adam Smith's understanding of the morality of capitalism. Capitalism would be a moral system if the mutual dependence which it speaks of was genuinely mutual, that there was no arbitrary dependence of one person on another. Mutual dependence is non-arbitrary. What I am here to say is contrary to freedom is arbitrary dependence on someone else's will. Okay, all of that's your first point. Your second point is purely historical, and it's a very, very important point. What motivated Hobbes was very clear. The radical tradition of Renaissance republicanism, of which Machiavelli was the greatest exponent, and which, of course, Harrington and the later tradition are repeating and developing, and the Americans above all, as I've said, saw a very close connection between freedom and forms of government. They wanted to say that because freedom is independence from the arbitrary will of another, you can only be free in a democracy. Hobbes is a very strong defender of absolute power. So he's a very strong defender of monarchy, and he wants it to be true that the question of whether you are free or not is independent of questions about forms of government. That's extremely important to Hobbes. Now, the theory of freedom, which enables you to say that there's no difference between a monarchy and a republic in respect of freedom, is a theory which says, look, what matters for freedom is not the source of the law. Did I make the law? That's not what matters for freedom, as a Republican thinks. The Republican thinks that unless I can recognizably see my will in the law, I'm not free. Hobbes is saying it's not who makes the law that's important for freedom, it's how many laws there are. It doesn't matter who makes them. If there are no laws, you're completely free. If there are some laws, you're less free. If there are lots of laws, you're much less free. And it's that analysis of freedom, that is absence of interference, which enables you to disconnect freedom from forms of government, which of course liberalism does. Even in Rawls, in order to get a democratic theory of the state out of his theory of freedom, he has to have a whole new cycle in the theory that explains why it would have to be democratic. If he had a different theory of freedom, he wouldn't need that. What he doesn't see is he's got the wrong theory of freedom. So he then has to have an independent defense of democracy. The Republican theory of freedom is an immediate defense of democracy, and that's what Hobbes hated. So that's the answer to that question. Very quickly on customs, yeah, of course customs are external, but the claim is that you inauthentically internalize them. They're external, but you make them internal. You think, I can't come here without wearing a tie. Really? I mean, that might be an I mean, actually, I quite like wearing ties, but that might be that would be the inauthentic internalizing of something which is external. You've now made it internal. Here's the tie. Okay. Yes, I think yes.
Thank you very much. So my relations are somewhat related, but I think they're different enough. So first of all, I think it's pretty clear that we have never been free, but it doesn't prevent us from pursuing that value. But I think your approach, the no dependence approach and the no interference approach, I mean, both of them suffer from one problem, which is the dualism the tension between society and individual, as if society is always bad and individual, there is an essence of the individual that can be oppressed by society. But I think a lot of great thinkers, sociologists, anthropologists, Pierre Bourdieu or Michel Foucault or even Anthony Giddens, so many scholars already have discredited this kind of idea, because society doesn't just oppress you, society enable you. If we don't have any rules, we are not just free. We won't be humans. For example, like we are all controlled by habitus in a conference room. We have certain rules. We feel at ease because I know the rules. If one day we have to be naked in order to in a conference room, then I don't think anybody will feel free. They will feel weird. So again, I think that dualism, assuming there's a universal human, as a black, that's pretty Lockean kind of idea that you have pure human being, and then all the things that add up to the human being, the human body. I think that's very wrong, because human bodies and minds, they are all socially, culturally constituted, and that doesn't make them less free. So that's the first question. And the second one is very related to the last question, but I just want to push you a little further, because last lecture on Monday, which is very fascinating, that you talk about text as actions, not just meaning content, but today we are filled with a lot of content and meanings of this Hobbesian theory. So and you talk about the action, but I think maybe it will help us if you can further locate the historical background, like what is the relationship between civil society, public sphere at the time, and the church and the state? What is Hobbes trying to do here more concretely? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm in despair because I haven't made myself clear to you at all. I agree entirely with what you say in your first remarks, and the thought that this is a kind of Lockean story is as far from my intentions as it's possible to be, because in the account that I'm giving, the state would be a very powerful enabler. It is a fact of human life, and surely Tony Giddens doesn't deny this, that we live in states. It's a terrible condition to be stateless, and all of us are citizens. So the question of the role of the citizen in relation to the state will not go away by making Foucauldian noises about solidarity. I'm very in favor of Foucauldian noises about solidarity, but it won't do to say this is a kind of individualist story which we know has been overcome by post-structuralism, because we know perfectly well that we are citizens in states with sets of rights which we think it important to protect against the state, and other rights which we think it's crucial to have the state in order to protect. So I think, of course, it isn't that Foucault really would deny any of that. I don't know what Tony would say about that, but he certainly wouldn't wish to deny any of that, and nor would I wish to deny any of that. My state would be an uncomfortably strong state, because it would take very seriously dependence within families, in the workplace, as well as in the law. So it would be legislating far more vigorously than states currently do about the regulation of the press, the regulation of employment laws, regulation of family laws, and it would have a very different view about international relations. International relations at the moment operates on liberal assumptions about non-interference, and therefore legitimizes a great deal of dependence-independence relationships. Consider the current role of China in Africa, or the current role of America in Africa. Dependence relationships are growing in the less developed world because of the conduct of our world. So any notions of mutual independence, and any notion that independence might be a moral value in international relations, I see very little of that. I would want that to become absolutely salient. If it did, it would be transformative in the notion of, in the name of something much more like human solidarity. So I agree with what you say, but you are making me sound as if I disagree with it, and that's very upsetting. Right, your other point. Well, there again, I'm very surprised by what you say, because could we have the pictures back? Why have the pictures gone? Yeah, can we? Is the technician still here? Oh, you have it. Okay. what you have in front of you, is entirely about speech acts. There are no names. There's no philosopher named on this account. I really want to see the picture. Ah, here it is. No one is named here at all. But if we start to put in names, so we found Hobbes here. And it turned out that there's a speech act question to ask about Hobbes is, well, he says no interference. Of course, we have to know what he says. I mean, I'm not here to say, and you don't want me to say, that philosophers shouldn't be interested in the meaning of the utterances in text. But for me, the crucial question is, what is he doing? Well, he's seeking to discredit that. The action is that of seeking to discredit, to set aside, to overturn. These are all speech acts. That's what interests me about Hobbes, is his attempt to overcome this story. What is Locke doing over here, talking about Hobbes? It's a more complex speech act. He's saying, well, basically, fundamentally, I agree, but there's something which needs to be added. So, agreeing, adding, questioning, refining. What is Bentham saying about Locke? He's saying it hasn't gone far enough. We need addition, refinement, addition. It's entirely about what they're doing. The whole thing's about what they're doing.
Well, I think maybe there's some misunderstanding. Actually, my question is really about how do you differentiate social relations and independence?
But your question was about why I didn't talk about speech acts. And why it was all about meaning.
Maybe it's because my view of speech act is that is always embedded in very specific context. So I thought the introduction of those historical points, the theories, I think they're very valuable, and I'm glad that I can, learn about them.
But the embedding is, I've tried to go into something that Hobbes doesn't say in his text, but which he is doing in his text, which is the secret truth about that text is he's trying to discredit republicanism. That's what motivates him. That's the underlying purpose of Leviathan. Those are the speech acts. Now that you don't get from the text, because you never get speech acts out of text, but that's what he's doing. And that's what I've tried to say. So I've tried to embed it as much as I can. Of course, in order to show you that that's the speech act, I have to tell you what he says, because all speech acts are speech as well as acts. But what interests me is the act. So I took it that you were saying, why did you talk about
because I was waiting to hear that, and I only hear that at 350 on the page 41. So I was like, oh, that was the thing that I was waiting for, because I totally agree with your approach that we should treat that text, that kind of text as, I'm so sorry that I accept you. I feel bad that I accept you.
We have several questions.
Thank you.
Succinct and Xu and we have so many questions. So, yeah.
Greatly appreciate for your talk. I think I'm a historian, so I want to ask a historical question.
Of the 17th century.
Late 16th century. Yes, I think it is reasonable to start your genealogy from Thomas Hobbes. However, if we went back to the early modern period, that is Hobbes' own time, religion and politics almost were one and the same. So now it seems reasonable to distinguish the liberty of a citizen living in an early modern state from that of a Christian living in the same state. So I take Martin Luther and his a treaty on Christian liberty, for example. Martin Luther indeed discussed about the liberty and Christian liberty in particular. For him, liberty is to get rid of all the burden of or the servitude of ceremonies and man-made inventions or traditions enforced by the church and the government, or put it simply, without the burden of conscience. So, would you think to merge his idea of liberty into your chart? Perhaps it would be difficult, but would you also like to give it a thought upon it, or
Good.
It would be very crucial to your idea. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you very much. You're pointing to an important limitation in what I've tried to talk about this afternoon. I've isolated what Hobbes calls civil liberty. Of course, he and anyone writing in the period is extremely interested in a relationship of civil liberty to religious liberty, and also interested in the question of what religious liberty might be. I haven't addressed that issue. I mean, if you invite me back, I could. There could be, of course, a very important lecture to be given about that. The most recent book I published, which had just come out last week, is this 2-volume study called Freedom and the Construction of Europe, in which we have a volume entirely about the idea of religious liberties in relation to these questions about civil liberties. So it's not that I haven't thought about it. I haven't, however, talked about it. What I would want to say, if I were to talk about it, is that the Lutheran account of Christian liberty is nevertheless largely to be analysed along the lines of freeing people from various forms of interference. So there's the interference of the papacy in the lives of states, for example, the fact that the papacy served as a taxing power. He regards that as interference, and talks about that in The Freedom of a Christian Man. But the main form of interference that he's worried about is any priestly interference with your relationship with God. So your freedom is in part freedom from those forms of interference. Now, he's also interested in a different way of thinking about freedom, which is that if you now think about your relationship with God, you realize that, in fact, you're wholly dependent upon him. And so he very subtly analyzes that dependency relationship, and his predestinarianism makes him almost a fatalist about that. Your relationship with God is you're a slave. He uses that language, he uses that vocabulary. So what's very striking about the pre-Hobbesian story is this willingness to talk about non-interference by institutions, as well as relationships of dependence. And Luther would be a very good example of both of those.
I just want to add one more reason for you to come back again, because last October, Matthew Kramer was here, invited by us. Yeah, he was. And now we have both figures on the either side of the debate. So maybe next time you should come together and have a debate. So my question is this. I think one of the reasons that contemporary liberals still, some of them still prefer the idea of non-interference, as a better idea for freedom is because I think they think that there is a private realm of individual lives that the state should not intrude upon, even if they are not under the arbitrary will of the state or the community as a whole. Even if they have democracy, even if they have rule of law, that makes the will that is imposed on them non-arbitrary. Still, I think that there's the realm that that we should be left alone. And so with this idea, non-interference is better able to capture the idea that, hey, you should leave us alone. So what do you think, how do you put the idea of privacy and the private realm in your theory?
Yeah, good, thank you. Well, this goes back to what I was saying in answer to the question before the last one, which is that the account that the neo-Roman would want to give about freedom is an account of what's fundamental about freedom. So the debate that I would have with someone like Matt Kramer, I mean, I hope you won't ask me to debate with him because he's extremely formidable, as you know, would be what's fundamental. And Matthew is the sort of person that I have been supposed to be. That's to say, he is someone who thinks that a private realm, which is completely sacred and must all parties must be held off it, they're all trespassers, that's the fundamental thing about freedom. I do not think that. And I'm sorry if I've been heard to say that, because that's exactly what I don't think. I think that what's fundamental is not questions about interference and non-interference. They're secondary. What's fundamental is dependence. And in order to talk about how to get rid of dependency relationships in our society, we would need to think about having a stronger state. It would have to be a very democratic state if we were going to give it sufficient powers to militate against dependency in our society. But the reason that someone like Matt doesn't want that is not just because he's an American liberal, so he doesn't want the state at all. It's because he has the view that what's fundamental is this notion of private rights. And I just don't, I'm skeptical about the whole discourse of rights myself. And so I'm coming at it from a completely different angle. And that's the difficulty that he and I have talking about it, really, is notice these are rival theories. And they have a different view about what the fundamental question is about freedom. Now, I don't, of course, feel skepticism about rights to such a degree that I don't think that there are such private rights that the state should be there to protect. I just don't think that that's the fundamental thing. I think that's sitting on top. So all this stuff about non-interference is non-fundamental for me, fundamental for him. What's fundamental for me is dependence, and that's nowhere on the map for him. So that's the difference between us.
I feel that I have some doubts on the theory of no dependence, probably just because it's very fundamental. Okay, and my doubts goes like this, because it seems to me that the relationship between master and slave doesn't equally means that the fact of dependence is equivalent to servitude, because it seems to be a little bit too strong. For example, the children depends on their parents. Old man depends on the young man. So that doesn't mean it must brings them to servitude. And I can, think about a kind of genealogy of this way of thinking. Just as you said, the ideas come from the contrast between master and slave. And when we read Aristotle's Politics, it starts with the relationship between the free man. So what does it mean? It means a special kind of social and political organization in which each free man can exercise their freedom. And we trace it back, it goes to the fundamental organization of the Western society. It means each man, when he passed the military test, then he become a free citizen. And this kind of social political organization emphasize on individuality. The free will and free exercise of the individual will. But if we compare this kind of society with other societies, we find that it is a special society. For example, when we think about a tribal society, in which everyone so closely depends on each other, their existence depends on the collective action and goodwill of each other. So then we find the so-called intra or intersubjectivity, in which one's subjectivity is closely, intertwined with others. And when we talk about family, some kind of society, for example, the Chinese society, Chinese political society has a strong relationship with family, in which we also have a very strong intra or intersubjectivity. So if we compare this kind of tribal society with the Greek society or the so-called Chinese society, we may find that this kind of idea of freedom is very Greek or very Western. So this kind of emphasis on no dependence, I can see it make perfect sense to me. Logically it makes sense, but it's too strong for two reasons. First, the fact of dependence, I quote your words, is equivalent to servitude. It's a little bit too strong. How about the children, the old man, and anyone who had to depend on others? Secondly, how the problem of intra and intersubjectivity? Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, I see that point, and I wanted to say that there are two arguments here, of which the second is the one that I put my emphasis on, and that was awareness of dependence. Now, what you, I think, rightly see might look like an overstatement is that my first argument was it's the fact of dependence which takes away freedom, and you find that an overstatement. Now, I think what I want to say is two things. One is that I agree with you that that's not where one should be laying the emphasis. The emphasis should be on awareness, not on the fact, because it's awareness of dependence that generates the mechanisms of self-censorship, which mean that the self undermines the conditions of freedom of the self. So I rather tend to accept that. But what I was signaling with my first point, and I want to hold to my first point, I should say, is that the person who is in the condition of the slave, that's to say, is living at the mercy of another, is someone who, insofar as they act without interference, will come to have the illusion that they are able to act freely. But at least on one interpretation of autonomy, they are never autonomous agents. They may have the illusion that they are, but they are never. There's no such thing as an autonomous action by this person, because all the actions have the quality of permissions. That's an attribute which is actually true of all of those actions, although it may not seem to be true of any of them. If you step out of line, you may discover that that is true, that actually you did not have this freedom. But the fundamental point about the fact of dependence taking away freedom is a claim about autonomy. So another way you could put my argument is that the liberal and the Republican have rival views about autonomy. An autonomous action for Matt Kramer is one where no one stops you from doing it. An autonomous act for the Republican is an act where your autonomy stems from your being independent, not from there being interference or non-interference. So the analysis of autonomy given by the Republican is not de facto, okay? And it is for the liberal. So what I'm defending here is a very strong account of autonomy, Kant's account of autonomy. And you're doubtful about that. And I do see that. I mean, I want to defend it, obviously, but I respect the doubt. You better have Matt Kramer back again. He can put this right.
Okay, two very short questions. The first one, I think I'm speaking for the American feminist philosopher Iris Young. Yeah, she was happy to use the term freedom as non-domination, and she was happy to say she learned it from contemporary republicanism like Philip Pettit. But I think she will be very hesitating to use the term freedom from an arbitrary power. Right, so the freedom from domination and the freedom from interference from arbitrary power is quite different, I think, for Iris Young. And I think there's one very important reason, because all the power you cite, the bosses, states, corporations, and the colonizers, the husbands, they are actually equipped with very strong power of rational ideologies. They are not really arbitrary power at their time. They are equipped with rational discourses and rational techniques, and they interfere with very reasonable reasons they provide. And the subjects, the slaves, they are not dominated by some arbitrary interference, but actually dominated by the rationality they give, right? So the main target of the non-domination, like Iris Young, is to criticize the rationality behind the bosses, the masters, not really the arbitrary powers, the medieval monarchies. They are too outdated for Iris Young. Right? This is the first question.
Yeah.
Right? The second one is, I'm curious why you stop talking Rousseau and Hegel, right? And I think the relationship between master and slave is central to Hegel and Rousseau. And there's one main point that you stop using them. I think that I want to listen to your reason. And the point is that for them, the master is dependent on the slave. They are psychologically dependent on the slave. They are also materially dependent on the slaves. And in that sense, the master is not free, right? But in your analysis of the Republican idea of freedom, you start talking like Rousseau and Hegel. I think Rousseau and Hegel, they are further step on the under Republicanism, there are further development. But I want to know why you don't go with them.
Okay, yeah, good. That's very interesting, that second. Well, they're both very interesting points. Just let me take up the first one first, about arbitrariness. Young, like all feminists of the period, was very sensitive, and rightly very sensitive, to questions about domination, and that was really what she was focusing on, and gender domination. I don't at all mind insisting that that's an instance of arbitrariness in the way that she does. I mean, she doesn't want to use that terminology, but the reason that I want to speak about arbitrariness is simply that what's echoing there is the original legal notion of the arbitrium, just meaning the will. By arbitrary, I mean simply that which resides in somebody's will, exclusively. I mean, it doesn't reside at all in law or in custom. It just resides in somebody's will and goes with commensurately unregulated power. So for me, arbitrary power simply is that which dominates and subordinates. I mean, that's just my way of talking about it. Now, on your second point, now that's extremely interesting, that Rousseau's view, I didn't talk about Rousseau because the only way to bring this under control is somehow to arbitrarily, divide it off. And so I decided to divide it off by language. And although I talked for a moment about Marx, I really talked about modern Marxists. But there's no way of dividing off this material. And of course, Rousseau is the great Republican. I mean, he is the ultimate Machiavellian, the ultimate enemy of Hobbes. So if I were to put him here, he would be right over there, talking about practically everything I've talked about. But what he would not be talking about is the yet more radical and Hegelian notion that the master is not free. Yeah. So there would be a way of endorsing my view, but which would have a dialectical form of reasoning, in which it's pointed out that the relationship of domination of the master of the slave generates dependence of the master upon the slave. And that's Hegel's thought in the Phenomenology. That's a very subtle thought. Notice that nothing I've said contradicts that. I've assumed, of course, that the master is free, but if you were able to show me that there's a sense in which even the master is not free, that wouldn't worry, that wouldn't upset this picture at all. It would simply add to it. It would add the possibility that we understand what it is to be unfree, and this was an objection that you had. It turns out nobody is free, not even the master is free. That's the paradox that Hegel is working with there. I didn't want to add that because I wasn't talking about Hegel, but it's something which the classical writers are also very interested in. Tacitus writes about the dependence of the master upon the slave, very subtly as well. And I mean, those classical sources would have been Hegel's sources, by the way. So the master-slave dialectic is something that one would certainly want to bear in mind here, yes.
Firstly, thank you for your talk this afternoon. And the two questions I want to raise for you. And after teaching a few years British modern history, I got some questions about the 19th century British history. Firstly is we know the economic rapid growth in the first half century of the 19th century in British history. So is there any the economic quickly grows, is there any connection between the idea of capitalism and the concept of the liberty? I mean, is there any connection between these two different ideas? Because we always say the growth of capitalism in the first half century of the 19th century is quickly expanded. So the idea of capitalism is also following the growth of economy. So that's the first question. And the second question is, if we study the history of Britain in the 19th century, we can see a marvelous apparent apparent phenomena of the trade union movement. And we also know the trade unionism did a lot of influence in shaping the social and economic development in British history. So generally speaking, to what extent you can explain the trade unionism affect the concept of liberty in the later half of the 19th century?
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Let me take the 2 points in turn. The view of freedom, which was hospitable to capitalism, was, of course, the liberal view. Because on the liberal analysis that freedom is non-interference, a free contract will be a contract in which there has been no interference with the freedom of the parties to sign. The Republican would say, well, that's not necessarily a free contract because the relations of domination and dependence may be such that the person signing the contract was not really in a position to do anything else. So the Republican view is much less hospitable to capitalist notion of freedom of contract than is the liberal view. And that helps to explain the discrediting of the Republican view. It is inconvenient to capitalism that it should have this much more extended understanding of the conditions that would enable us to say that someone has acted unfreely. So the story of it still remains to be written, but the story of the acceptance of Hobbes's philosophy by the Scottish Enlightenment and thus by Hume and above all by Adam Smith, their ridiculing of especially in Hume, ridiculing of the idea that dependence might take away freedom, paves the way for a capitalist understanding of freedom of contract. So there is that strong relationship there. Now, to take up your point about trade unionism, that's extremely interesting likewise, because one of the very important features of the 19th century trade union movement in England, and especially in the Chartist movement that preceded and founded it, was the attempt to resuscitate a Republican, a neo-Roman view of freedom in order to try to protect working people against the depredations of the free market, where the free market was free in the sense that there was no interference with people accepting contractual freedom. So, for example, one of the most important of the so-called 6 points of the Chartists, where they tried for a different politics, was the demand for annual parliaments. And the reason that you want parliaments to be resummoned every year is to prevent them from getting powers which are too independent of those who are electing them. So that if you elect for a long time, you set up patronage systems, the power of the people to affect what happens continually diminishes because government is able to act with increasing freedom from those who've elected it. So you get yourself in a position of dependence upon them. But dependence is unfreedom. And that was absolutely fundamental to Chartism, that it embodied a Republican view of freedom. That was also very important in relation to wanting a secret ballot. Because if the ballot is not secret, and your employer is present when you vote, and your employer sees how you vote and doesn't like it, then in a non-unionized economy, you've lost your job.
Thank you for giving us such a wonderful genealogy of liberty. I just would like to ask you to clarify, in the very end of your talk, your comment on Rawls.
Yes, yes.
You seem to say that he endorses the non-interference conception of liberty. Aside now that he sort of emphasized basic liberties, and he has a list of basic liberties. One kind of basic liberties he sort of emphasized and giving it priority is that of liberties associated with the rule of law. It seems to me that the idea of rule of law is sort of, I would say, belongs to this non-independence view of liberty, right? You live in a state that cherish the idea of law, meaning you can sort of count on what law demands, so you can plan your life. Therefore, you have freedom. And for him, my question for him, the liberties associated with the idea of rule of law is very important. It's one of the basic liberties.
Yes.
So it seems to me that that he sort of endorsed a more complicated view about liberties. No?
Yes. Well, thank you. But that's a very important point, but it points to a very important structural weakness in Rawls's treatise. And this weakness was originally pointed out by Herbert Hart, the greatest of the English jurists, in his original review of A Theory of Justice, in which Rawls wants to say that his theory of justice is a theory of equal liberty. But in the treatise, he uses the term in two different ways. He talks about liberties in the plural, which are basic rights, okay? So you might have this or that liberty, which was a freedom right. And that's fundamental to the structure of his theory, that there should be protected liberties, that's to say rights. But the theory is founded on a notion of freedom, not in the plural, not liberties, but it's a theory of equal freedom. Now, what is this equal freedom? And his account of what that equal freedom is analysed in terms of McCallum's celebrated attack on Isaiah Berlin, in which he wanted to say there's just one view of freedom. There can't be two concepts of liberty. There can only be one concept of liberty, because all acts of taking away of liberty are acts of interference. Now, Rawls is completely explicit in A Theory of Justice that he agrees with that. So if we're talking not about liberties, set them aside for a moment, but the fundamental structure of the theory as a theory of liberty, it is a theory of liberty as non-interference. Now, I'm saying that is heavily contestable, but it's an uncontested assumption of that theory. Now, if you turn to Rawls's later treatise on democratic liberalism, he's changed his mind. He's seen this himself. And of course, he was very worried by Herbert Hart's review. I mean, that was the most radical criticism that he received in the first generation of discussion of his. Much the most interesting criticism came from Hart, as you'd expect. And he tries to say that what he's trying to do is to render his theory compatible with what he calls civic humanist view of freedom. I'm proud to say that the footnote which says he needs to reconsider this is to my own work. So I'm proud to have appeared in the second treatise where he is trying to say that they are compatible. What I don't see is that he's made the changes to his theory which would be required by saying what's fundamental about freedom is dependency relationships, because that would have required him to reconstruct the theory. So, for example, we wouldn't have had all that stuff about how the theory is democratic, because it would have been democratic straight away. And his theory is not democratic straight away. He has to make it democratic. So it would have a different structure, and I don't think he ever quite came to terms with that. But at the time when I knew him, at the time when we were colleagues and talked a great deal about this, he was extremely keen that what I'm here identifying as a weakness in his theory was one he wanted to correct. But what that was to recognize was the distinction in his theory between liberties and liberty.
Okay. We asked this concept of laws translated in Chinese.
Ah.
Yeah. We just
Oh, really?
Yeah. Am I right? John Rawls was part of this?
Yes. Well, Rawls could see, as anyone could see, that Hart was a very great theorist of law and learned a great deal from him, I think. There's a big correspondence. Now all of John Rawls's papers are in Harvard, and they're all catalogued and you can read them. So there's a big correspondence with Hart, yes.
To answer Kevin's question, am I right? Am I eligible to answer your question?
Oh, of course. I wish you would. I'm tired.
In my PhD student day, I always consider myself as a slave. We all know that Professor Skinner is a very powerful speaker. Now today we witness it. So let us thank Professor Quentin Skinner again.